Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 934 of the Juicebox Podcast. On today's episode of the Juicebox Podcast, Ed Damiano from Beta Bionics is here to talk about the iLet Bionic Pancreas. Ed and I had an almost 2-hour-long conversation about iLet. I got in a ton of listener questions. Ed told me all about the company, how things started, where it is now, when he expects people to be holding an iLet, and so much more. While you're listening, please remember that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan or becoming bold with insulin. Here are 3 quick ways you can save money. Your first month of online therapy, BetterHelp.com/Juicebox. Use the link to save 10% off that first month. The offer code Juicebox at checkout at CozyEarth.com will save you 35% off your entire order. And if you want to try AG1, go to athleticgreens.com/Juicebox. When you do, you'll get 5 free travel packs and a free year supply of vitamin D with your first order. This episode of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by US Med. US Med is the place where my daughter gets her diabetes supplies from, and you can too. Go to usmed.com/Juicebox or call 888-721-1514 to get your free benefits check. US Med always provides 90 days worth of supplies, and they have fast and free shipping. They carry everything from insulin pumps to CGMs to diabetes testing supplies. You want the Libre 2, the Libre 3, the Dexcom G6, or Dexcom G7? US Med has it. You want Omnipod 5? You want Omnipod DASH? US Med has that too. They have Tandem T-Slim X2. Oh my goodness, they have it if you're looking for it. usmed.com/Juicebox. Before Ed comes on, let me tell you 2 things. There are some ads that are in this episode, but I'm not going to put them in the conversation. They're at the end. So if you want to hear them, please hang out and listen. I appreciate that very much. I want to remind you to go to the private Facebook group, Juicebox Podcast, Type 1 Diabetes. Head in there. There's 40,000 active members. It is the most lively and lovely diabetes Facebook group known to man. That's my opinion. If you're looking for the Bold Beginnings Diabetes Pro Tip Series, Type 2 Diabetes Pro Tip Series, Defining Thyroid, all of the things that people who listen to the podcast love. If you can't find them in your podcast app, go to juiceboxpodcast.com. There's a menu at the top. You'll be able to find everything there. Or if you're in the private Facebook group, hit the feature tab at the top of the group. If you have a question about diabetes or autoimmune issues in general, we've covered it on the Juicebox Podcast. Welcome back, even though you don't remember ever being on the show. And I barely remember talking to you, but you were definitely on this podcast in the first year of it.
Wow.
I cannot find in the list anywhere. Like, what would you have been calling it iLet back then?
No. So if you think it was 2015, we definitely had my wife was the one who named it the iLet. I called it the Bionic Pancreas before we had the name iLet, and she came up with the name iLet. And I think that happened in 2013 is my guess. But we weren't, we were using both terms sort of interchangeably. There was no company in 2013 or even 2014.
Wow. Well, so then how did this all start? I'm assuming your child has diabetes, right?
Yeah. So that is how I got involved with this. So my background is in applied mathematics, and specifically I do what I would describe as mathematical biology. That's what I used to study. And what does that mean? I would looking at mathematical models of how the inner ear works and the fluid structure interactions that happen when you move your head through space, the vestibular system and your sense of balance and equilibrium. Understanding the underlying mechanics of that was very much a mathematics problem. And I spent some time working on that. I got very interested in blood flow in the very smallest microvessels in the microcirculation, blood flow through capillaries, and understanding various important physiological phenomena that are connected to blood flow in microvessels. And that became a big part of my research effort. And that's kind of what I did. It was extremely theoretical, not not the least bit practical. I would publish papers in the Journal of Fluid Mechanics and, PNAS and things like that. And, there were 3 people who read the papers and I was 2 of them. That's what I used to say. So it was very, very arcane stuff. And I enjoyed it very much. And certainly I could build a career around it. But when my son developed type 1 in infancy, he was 11 months old, it became pretty clear that, I had some basic skill sets that I could lend to the problem of building a device that could control blood sugar levels. And I had a student at the time, Firas Al-Khatib, who was he was a master's student in my lab, and he'd just come over to the U.S. and he was doing some work in my area of blood flow. I had him working on a problem that he wasn't much interested in, frankly. And he'd finished his master's thesis, and he was sort of looking around for something else. And just 5 months after Firas arrived, David developed type 1. He was, as I said, 11 months old. My wife's a pediatrician, and she actually made the diagnosis. And I turned to Firas a year or so later saying, listen, I've been thinking about a device that could deliver insulin and glucagon to automatically regulate glucose in people with type 1. And at the heart of that is software, is smart, intelligent software that determines how much insulin and glucagon to deliver to get good glucose control based on a continuous stream of data from something like a continuous glucose monitor that didn't really exist in 2000 or 2001 or 2. There was the Gluco Watch, you may recall, the Cygnus Gluco Watch. Yeah. That was in 2000. And that didn't work particularly well, but it did get FDA approved. And so I envisioned that we would build the software that makes those dosing decisions. And he got really interested in that. I offered that up as a potential PhD project. And that became the sum and substance of his PhD. And that was around 2002. So a little over 20 years, we started thinking about what that centerpiece, technology would do, how it might work. And he started working on developing the mathematical algorithms. Initially, it was a single algorithm. Now we have 3 separate algorithms that run in parallel on the Islet. And that was at that time, he and I were at the University of Illinois. I was a professor of mechanical engineering, and this is in Urbana-Champaign, and he was my PhD student. He finishes his PhD in my lab at UIUC at Illinois, and then I went to Boston University in 2004, took a faculty position in biomedical engineering. Firas came over to Boston and did a postdoc in my lab. Firas still works with us today at Beta Bionics, so he's VP of Research Innovation, and so he stuck with this project from the very beginning. We came to BU and started animal studies looking at glucose control with the algorithms that he'd been developing for his PhD in pigs that we could induce diabetes-like pathology in. And we could test the system in basically pigs with diabetes. We did that for about 3 or 4 years. And then I met Stephen Russell, my clinical collaborator of many years now, 17 years, I think, in 2006 at Joslin Diabetes Center. He was doing a fellowship. He was doing his postdoc fellow there. And so we started collaborating on bringing that system to human trials. And by 2008, we'd started clinical trials at the Massachusetts General Hospital Clinical Research Center in the inpatient setting.
While you've been talking, it occurred to me, I don't think you've been on the podcast.
I would totally believe you if you said it either way.
Something about when you said Boston, it hit me, and I researched, not researched, but searched my blog just now.
Yeah.
And in 2016, January, a woman named Kelly was on to talk about being in your trial. That's what this is.
Yeah, that's much later.
And your name rings my bell because of that. And obviously I know who you are. We've never met before. I know your face. You and I have never met before. And if somebody asked me to describe you, I could do it. Right. So I'm that aware of who you are. But yeah, I think that's what I was thinking of. Wow, that was the 40. Oh, no kidding. Okay.
I've done a lot of interviews, as you might imagine, and so I could easily be convinced that I've given an interview to just about anybody.
I want to be completely honest. There are lovely people who help me with the Facebook group, and if someone asks a question, I'll say, "I don't know. Have I ever said that?" And somebody else will have to come in and tell me if I said it or not. I'm beyond being upset or embarrassed by that. So that's how you get this whole thing going. That's fascinating. But my daughter was 2 when she was diagnosed, right after her 2nd birthday. I do not meet a lot of people whose kids were younger than that usually.
No, it's extremely rare.
Mhm.
I mean, I think it's, probably just a handful of people who are diagnosed under the age of 1 with type 1. You have some kids who get this neonatal diabetes.
Mhm.
That is something that's exceedingly rare, but it happens, and it's often misdiagnosed as type 1. We actually thought David might have that, but neonatal usually see that around 6 months of age, and he was around 11 months.
Yeah.
So he was actually old for neonatal. We did some testing, and it was pretty clear that he doesn't have neonatal. He has type 1. But he's been on an insulin pump since 13 months of age.
Wow. Which one did he have then?
Minimed 508.
Wow. You don't hear those.
And we used his old Minimed pump in the pig studies. So once he graduated to the Animus, we took his Minimed pump and put it in the pig studies.
Yeah. How about that? Do you have other children?
Yeah, my daughter's 2 years older than David, so she's 26 now. David's 24, and she just finished grad school, and she's going to go into another grad program in the fall.
Wow. Any other autoimmune in your family?
Yeah, Emily herself, she has celiac disease.
Okay.
So that was diagnosed. Toby was doing a workup on her just for short stature, and she thought maybe she should build taller. And she ended up having celiac. That's sort of in the panel when you look at that kind of thing. So she was around 12 or so when we figured that out.
My daughter was the smallest person in her school, and we figured out she had hypothyroidism, and she's 18 now, and she's 5'7".
Oh, good for you. So she did just fine. My wife's 5'7".
Yeah, we
That's
caught it's a good height. Yeah. But we caught it. I mean, I'll never know what would happen if it wouldn't have got caught, but it was hard not to catch. She was like basically passing out, like asleep. She had no like energy at all.
No energy at all.
Yeah. But it was just really something. Like she was the tiniest little person. And then now she just isn't. It's really something else what the right thing can do to help you. All right. So that's got to be enough. Everybody's like, just ask the questions, Scott.
Well, we certainly have a kinship there with a very young person, and to watch it through infancy, diabetes progress through infancy into toddlerhood, and preschool age, and then the school age kid, and the teenager, and now the young adult. Yeah. To see that whole arc pass before me over the past 20 years is quite an amazing thing.
It gives you a perspective that a lot of people don't have either. You can kind of really step back sometimes and see all of the different impacts that I think get lost on people from time to time.
Yeah.
It's it really is been a hell of a journey. Okay, so modern day. A few weeks ago, I was speaking at an event. I met Stephen Russell. Right, he works.
Yeah, you did.
Mm-hmm. And he was like, spilling the beans that you guys were about to get an FDA approval. So tell me about that process a little bit. So once you say, we've got a thing, it works, this is the thing we want the FDA to say yes to. Like, when was that? How long have you been at that part?
Great question. So I think it'll surprise you. In order to be really ready to submit an application to get market approval or market clearance, as it's called, by the FDA for this device, you have to have a clinical data set that is collected in a pivotal trial. Mm-hmm. And what that means is that you conduct a study that you design with the FDA. You work with the FDA to design what that trial looks like, and it has to. You have to capture data in such a way that you've got a good quality system wrapped around it, and you're pulling the data together. We use the Jabe Center for Health Research as the contract research organization to help us put that package together. And then you build a clinical study report at the end of the trial. Mm-hmm. And the Jabe Center puts this together. We have input into that document. But ultimately, once the clinical study report's written, it has all the data that was captured from that pivotal trial. And all the other testing for the device is done, which is an enormous amount of work because you're building the system from scratch. The Islet is, in fact, a device that's built at Beta Bionics, not by contract manufacturing. We build it in our own facility in Irvine, California. And building a device is a non-trivial task, a durable medical, a piece of durable medical equipment. And so it has its own quality system wrapped around it. We have a manufacturing process at Beta Bionics to build the system. And then it undergoes an enormous amount of testing. All kinds of tests that were done for insulin pumps also had to be done for a bionic pancreas, along with this clinical data set that was captured to this very large pivotal trial. You pull all that together in a document that is tens of thousands of pages long, literally, and we submit that to the FDA. So the clinical trial, the data needed for that trial was basically in hand in December of 2021.
Okay.
All right. So the substance of the trial happened between January and October of 2021. And the Jape Center worked really quickly to lock the database after the last participant last visit in October of 21. And essentially within 2 months, they had the readout of the primary outcome analyses that we were waiting for. We were very pleased with the results, and then went the process of building the clinical study report into the early part of 2022.
Okay.
And so by 2022, March of 22, we submit the application, and we got clearance in May of 23. So 14 months later.
I'm going to forget I don't know the terminology, but were you able to claim that your device was similar to another device, or did you have to start from scratch?
No. So we used, I hope you're not getting this. There's a guy doing some yard work here. I hope you're not getting that. Hopefully your editing can do something magical.
It seems okay. Yeah, I think
that
microphone good. I made them send you was very close to your face. So I don't
I think it's working well. And I've got the headset and everything. I can hear it, but as long as you can't, that's great. Yeah. So yes, the hybrid closed loop systems on the market today, we could use one of those as the predicate device, to, as they call it, to our application. And so the FDA suggested that we use that as the predicate device. And we went forward with that submission with that in mind.
So are you able to get the device okayed and the process okayed in the algorithm at the same time, or did you have to make the pump, prove the pump work, and then step forward and do the next piece?
No, in fact, we had no intention of ever building an insulin pump, and I really want to make it clear that the Bionic Pancreas isn't an insulin pump, and that's not just semantics. It's really not. Okay. There's no way to program basal rates, carbs, insulin ratios, or correction factors on the Islet. There's no setting of parameters like that, so you can't operate the Islet in any configuration other than closed loop. So it's 100% of every dose is determined autonomously by the device, and even if the CGM goes offline, you enter finger stick measurements to keep it going, and it will use the finger stick BG to determine the dose at the time if necessary and dose automatically at that time. Wow. So the more finger sticks you enter when the CGM's offline, the more better glucose control you could get, because it has more opportunities to check in, but it gives basal insulin when the CGM's offline because it figured out the basal rate. So there's no insulin pump under the hood like there is with hybrid systems.
At all. There's no manual mode to go through. This thing
There's no manual mode. And why that's important is because, there's a number of reasons why it's important, but in the context of your question, every other hybrid closed loop, all the hybrid closed loop systems, and I would say the Islet isn't that, but the hybrid closed loop systems started as insulin pumps, and they all started in a world where you didn't need clinical data. Insulin pumps don't require clinical data. They require what's called human factors studies, where people come into a conference room, they won't hook up to the device, but they'll go through the user interface and show that they can do the basic functions. And then if that human factors report goes into their market application. So the tandem system, the T-Slim pump, for example, the Omnipod 5, the Medtronic system, the Omnipod, not 5, but the early Omnipod system and the Medtronic insulin pumps all went through human factors testing, but they didn't require any clinical trial data. We did not make a user interface where the Islet could be a standalone manual insulin pump, in which case, if we had done that, we could have put that through the FDA a few years earlier, had a manual insulin pump, and wouldn't have needed a clinical trial for that product. But to add the algorithms needs the clinical trial. We did it all simultaneously.
So not to be too obtuse, but basically the Islet is like a self-driving car with no steering wheel and no pedals, and the algorithm, you get in and it drives you where you go.
That's not obtuse at all. That is exactly the analogy I make all the time.
Oh, okay, great.
Right. So it's like sitting in the passenger seat of a self-driving car. You can't adjust the insulin dose. You can't. You can't override an insulin dose. You can't give a bolus. Right. So you can watch the thing control your blood sugar. Right. You can watch the self-driving car go, and you can watch it turn its steering wheel and so forth. But it really is determining 100% of every dose. Now, you can one way to interface with the device is to let it know that you're having a meal. And we have something called a meal announcement, which we can talk about. But even that, when you issue a meal announcement, you're not determining the size of the insulin dose that is delivered in response to that. It figures that out by itself. And then it comes to know what that appropriate dose should be when you give a meal announcement for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then it cleans up the rest downstream of that. We can talk a little bit more in detail about how that works. I think that'll be a worthwhile thing to talk about.
Yeah, no, for certain. I have one more question about that, then we can definitely move on. Am I wrong to say that in the very, very beginning, you imagined this happening with a tandem pump?
No.
No?
Yeah. So no, not no at all. Actually, in the very beginning, I imagined it happening with something called the aviator pump.
Oh,
I
really?
presume you've never heard of that.
No.
So Dean Kamen had built a pump that was 510K cleared, a traditional insulin pump, and he licensed it to Abbott Diabetes Care. Abbott had possession of this Abbott Navigator, which my son used from 2008 to 2012. It was in the US at that time. And it was a continuous glucose monitor, a phenomenal one, really. And the notion was we were working with the guys at Abbott to put our algorithms in between the Aviator insulin pump and the Navigator CGM, and we would be the smarts in the middle. And what happened was Abbott had a change of heart, and they did not proceed with the Aviator pump. They never marketed it, even though it was 510K cleared. And the Navigator itself, they abandoned that product in favor of what is now the Libre and flash glucose monitoring. So I found myself without a partner. I never intended to start a company. I never intended to build a cardboard platform. My intention was to take the software that Fearless and I were working on and collaborate with Stephen to test it in human trials and then license it off, or BU, Boston University, would license that off to an Abbott or a Medtronic or a Tandem.
Yeah.
So we did start talking with Tandem, because one of the reasons Tandem is called Tandem, as I understood it from 2011, is because they were always contemplating multiple fluids, pushing multiple fluids, not just one.
Okay.
And so there was great interest in a dual chamber T-Slim pump. And I was working with a guy named Sean Saint, who is now our current CEO at Beta.
Sean
in
was
2000.
Companion? Am I right about that?
Well, he was not when I met him.
No.
When I met him, he was a young whippersnapper engineer at Tandem Diabetes in 2011, and he approached me at an ADA conference, and he said, we think we're about to get 510K clearance of the T-Slim pump, which he was right. A few months later, he did. And I started working directly with Sean in 2012 to build our first mobile device that ran on an iPhone 4S and commanded insulin and glucagon doses out of two independent Tandem T-Slim pumps. Mm-hmm. And the woman, Kelly, you interviewed would have used that system. So you put two T-Slim pumps in your pocket. One delivered insulin, one was repurposed to deliver glucagon, and this giant brick that had an iPhone 4S on one side and a G4 Dexcom receiver all bundled together.
Right. And
that was our iPhone Bionic Pancreas for about 8 years. We used that thing.
Wow, that's something. Look how far it's come and how long it takes is a little humbling, actually.
For me in particular, I mean, I never expected this. First of all, I never expected to build the whole thing or build the team that built the whole thing. But I never would have expected it would take as long as it did and cost as much money as it did.
Yeah.
It's just a huge undertaking to build the infrastructure to do something like this.
It's funny because when you talk about the first idea, like, it occurs to me, couldn't any pump company just accept a bunch of algorithms from a bunch of different places and say, look, just choose the one you want to use and we could adapt? But I guess everybody wants to be proprietary at some point, right?
It's not just that. You're right. That has historically been the case. But until recently, the FDA didn't make that easy. And the FDA sort of wanted to get out of its own way. It didn't like the fact that there are all these different companies making algorithms. Mostly academic groups back then, right? Not so much companies, but mostly academic groups. And companies were licensing algorithms from academia. But then you had a few companies making pumps and you had a few companies making sensors. And so initially, the idea was at the FDA is that we want these sensors, these continuous glucose monitors, of which there were like 3 on the market, and now there are a few more, to be able to talk to any one of these pumps and integrate with any one of them. And then they evolved their thinking to say, okay, now let's allow these pumps, a certain type of pump, to not only talk to any one of these CGMs, which they dubbed iCGM, interoperable continuous glucose monitor. But then they made this thing called ACE pump, which was a device that could talk to any one of these iCGMs and could host algorithms. And you could just plug and play. This ACE pump can work with this iCGM, that one, or the other one. And this iCGM can work with these 3 ACE pumps. And that they wanted that interoperability. And then they said, to sort of flesh it out, the third technology in this piece, right, in this system, are the algorithms. And then they came up with something called IAGC, Interoperable Automated Glucose Controller, which was one of these plug and play algorithm 510Ks or market applications. So now you could have an IAGC tested in one ACE pump with one iCGM. And once you do the clinical data, collect the clinical data for that ACE pump, IAGC, you could put it in different ACE pumps without having to do another clinical trial. And you could make it talk to other iCGMs without having to do another clinical trial. So they're trying to be able to really promote this interoperability and all this different cross communication in this ecosystem of CGMs, pumps, and algorithms. Mm-hmm. And so they gave birth to all of these three different regulatory pathways, and now we have an interoperable space that, for the first time, now that as of just recently, in addition to the G6 Dexcom, which is a iCGM, there's now the G7 Dexcom on the market, which is an iCGM, and there is the Libre 3, which is an iCGM. It's the first time we've had more than one iCGM out there.
Right. Did you ever consider licensing it to pump companies? Or was
that's what I wanted to do.
That is what you really
That was
wanted,
my initial
right?
intent. And that's why I was working so closely with Abbott. And the problem with this was that when you start working with the medtech industry, they can become quite capricious. And the reason is, especially big medtech, you have these divisions, diabetes divisions in these big medtech companies. So they do a bunch of things, right? But one thing they do is diabetes, and they have a diabetes division, and they have a president of that division. The president of that division, if they are very successful, very often gets promoted into some other space like cardiovascular within that company, leaving in that person's wake the need for his or her replacement. So another president comes in with totally different objectives. And they might say, I want to pivot away from type 1 to type 2. And this technology that my predecessor's been investing in, I'm going to divest all of our interests in that and move into a new product. And they carve out their own little legacy for themselves. And so I couldn't rely on the medtech industry. I saw no way to do that when there's that kind of capriciousness happening in the system. It's built right in to the way these companies evolve.
You don't want to spend 6 years turning yourself into the right quarterback, and then your coach leaves and he says, I want to run the ball more. And now,
exactly.
And now you're just done. I get it. Okay. Wow. I don't think I have any more questions around that part of it.
There's a lot of history, right? We could talk for an entire podcast on the history of this.
Yeah, for sure.
But the long and the short of it is we ultimately evolved our thinking through experience that we had to build this thing ourselves from the ground up, and soup to nuts.
And so iLet, because it's not an insulin pump, it needed a different name. So that word just doesn't exist in your day.
Yeah. So it's funny because if you think about the evolution of my terminology, I go from the nerdiest of terms that you could imagine, like a geeky engineer. And if you look at my slide decks from 2008, 9, 10, 11, my terminology gets worse and worse. And I hit an all-time low in 2011. So initially I called it a closed loop blood glucose control system. It just rolls right off your tongue, right? And then I realized that that's just not, it's a very academic, thing. Engineer in particular would say a thing like that. And then I tried to come up with better terms. And I never liked artificial pancreas, because artificial pancreas tells you what it isn't. It isn't a real pancreas. And we know it's not a real pancreas. Can we have something that's more descriptive? So my lowest moment was when I called it a prosthetic pancreas. And I may as well just shown a picture of a little pump with crutches on either side of it, right? But in fact, it wasn't it is a prosthesis, if you will, in a way, but it's just not the right terminology. The next year, I said, what is it? Let's be positively descriptive and not negatively descriptive, what it isn't. And then I thought about Bionic Pancreas. And I looked in the dictionary, and it's a technology that imitates, biological processes through electromechanical systems and electronic means. That's exactly what we do. Mm-hmm. And so I coined that term in, I think, 2012, and I've used it ever since. And that's kind of the category. It's a bionic pancreas. My wife came along a couple of years later and said, I know what the device should be called. It should be called an Islet bionic pancreas, obviously an homage to the islets of Langerhans.
Yeah. That's a great idea. Also, I don't want to get off topic before we get on topic, but how come you're an engineer and so personable?
I don't know. I think that engineers get a bad rap, know?
Okay. All right. That's fair.
I think many of them can be quite personable.
Excellent. I'm just like, wow, you're like a good storyteller. And
when you tell the story enough times, it becomes rote.
Yeah. There are a couple things in my head that if I say I can shut off while I'm saying them, because I've said them enough.
Of course.
All right. So, you've got your clearance. Now, I am assuming you're a smaller company. So what's it like? There's got to be a ramp up plan, right? Like you're going to launch, and then how do you foresee that going?
Yeah, so I can give you a little bit insight into our vision for how that should work. Remember, we did, as I said earlier, a pivotal trial. So we took the Islet By the end of 2020, we had basically locked this thing into this little device that looks just like this thing I was just showing you.
Yeah.
And we could then, with funding from the National Institutes of Health, we had a large grant from the NIH to help pay for this study. It was what's called an investigator-initiated trial. So Beta Bionics didn't sponsor the study. It was basically sponsored by that Jaeb Center for Health Research. The grant came in through my lab at Boston University, and it dispensed out to 16 clinical sites. And so we had subcontracts, sites at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Stanford University, and Massachusetts General Hospital, and so on and so forth. We had 16 sites, and we chose these sites carefully. Stephen Russell, myself, and Roy Beck sort of went through across the country, and he said, we really want to pick sites that can bring a lot of ethnic diversity into the trial. So we don't have, a study that's consists almost entirely of white, very wealthy, and very educated people, but rather a study that is a much better cross-section and a better mirror of the population at large. Mm-hmm. So we chose sites in Northern Florida, in Southern Texas, in Detroit, in Atlanta, Southern California, where we could get in a lot of ethnic diversity into our cohort and bring a broader demographic into the study. So we designed that study with those 16 sites as the targeted places where they'd each bring in anywhere between 20 and 35 participants over the course of that 2021 calendar year. And that was really always my thinking about how we should bring this thing out. We should start by using those sites as the places to launch the device. And when Sean Saint came on board as CEO over the summer, I think that jibed well with him. He's like, okay, well, we'll build a sales team, and they'll break up the country into sort of 8. It's a targeted launch. We break the country up to 8 territories. Mm-hmm. Within each of those territories resides 1 or 2 of our pivotal trial sites from that study. And so those are the people who are, in my mind, the de facto experts of using the Islet. They're the only ones who've ever used it in a close to real world setting. Our trial was designed to be a very good approximation of real world usage. People were on the device for 13 weeks. So they understood the device in a way nobody else could. Until you use it, you can't really understand and appreciate it. Yeah. We thought that was the best place to start. Now, in each of those regions, those territories, there are several other sites that are also going to participate in our launch. But we are moving very quickly. And because we're a small company, as you mentioned, there's a kind of agility that we have that allows us to go from getting 510K clearance in a company that's never launched a product to launching the product within the space of about a month. Yeah. So, we have certainly launched the Islet. It is, we're using a distributor durable medical equipment approach to distributing the device, like a traditional insulin pump would follow. And so we've shipped our product out to distributors, and they can in turn ship those to people with type 1 diabetes, and typically in those regions. And those regions cover a big section of the U.S. Right. And so we just want to get our feet wet in the first few months and just get experience with the pivotal trial sites, and then expand and add territories in the fall, mm-hmm. and then more sites as well.
Do you see it as a years-long project to get up? Like, when will everybody be able to walk into their doctor's office and say Islet?
Good question. So right now at launch, we weren't able to get, for example, Medicare and Medicaid services to cover the device. This is a device that you would use private insurance and government insurance to pay for the device. You'd have a copay, just like a traditional insulin pump, and similar to the supplies. But we weren't allowed to negotiate with CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, prior to 510K clearance, which we only obtained, just a little less than 4 weeks ago. Once we got 510K clearance, we can start entering into a contract with CMS, and that takes anywhere between 2 and 3 months. Yeah. So anybody on Medicare, Medicaid services needs to know that we can't get it out to them right away, just because there was no way we could have teed that up prior to clearance.
You can't have the conversation before the clearance.
Exactly. But with commercial insurance, we were able to, through the distributor network, distributors across the country that sell insulin pump supplies, we were able to set up contracts with them. So the minute we got clearance, they could place an order. So we literally took orders right away upon FDA clearance. That allows us to get out to a lot of people in the country in the back half of this year who have private pay. And we're hoping by, say, the fourth quarter, maybe even sooner than that, third or fourth quarter, we'll get government insurance on board once that contract sells. And that'll allow us, again, to then penetrate further out and reach more people.
Who do you see as your target user group?
The vast majority of people with type 1, but specifically, we see this technology as playing really well in the hands of people who are on MDI therapy, in the hands of people who are willing to, and I think this is most people, let go of their diabetes management as much as possible. Mm-hmm. And what I would say is who it's not for is who we call the knob turners. And I would have to admit that I am probably one such person, right? And I bet you are as well.
Yeah. Yeah,
right.
Probably.
Probably. So what do? Well, we have this little tiny child in front of us who has type 1 diabetes, and we are going to pour all of our energies into making sure this kid's glucose is as tightly controlled as possible without destroying their lives, right? We don't want to interfere with their lives so much that they're just a little experiment. So you have to do it in a way that, they can coexist with this, but you want to give them as good a care as you can. So we were all over this little guy, and we grew him up that way. And he organically began taking more and more responsibility of his diabetes management. But I have to say that in taking over that responsibility over the course of a decade, to the point where he goes off to college with a Animas pump and a G6 Dexcom, or G5 Dexcom back then, he's doing a really good job managing his diabetes. And he is a tinkerer. He's going to do fine tuning of insulin dosing. He's all over it multiple times a day. Now, many people who do that and do well with that are going to be able to use the iLet successfully and comfortably. Mm-hmm. There may be an adjustment that they need to make and get used to handing the steering wheel off to some, autonomous system, but they can sometimes make the adjustment. There are others who won't be able to. It'll provoke too much anxiety and they just won't get through it. And the reality is you don't know what sort of person you are until you try it. Mm-hmm. So living with the iLet is the only way to find out if you can let go of the wheel, as you like to say.
Yeah.
And so we will offer a 90-day return policy with the iLet. So we really want to make sure that the right people find this device, but we also want to make sure that those who find that the device is not right for them, find a way to a device that is a loop system or a more of a manual system where you can, you can take more responsibility over insulin dosing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so what's straight from the listener questions? What's the target A1C going to be? Like, what do you expect the iLet to pull for people?
Well, so our pivotal trial was, by the way, the largest pivotal trial ever conducted for a automated insulin delivery system. It was a huge trial, and we enrolled children and adults simultaneously. So we went all the way down to age 6 and all the way up to age 83. Mm-hmm. So we had a very broad range of ages. And if you typically, the way you think about, where the A1C comes in is you typically look at adults separately from pediatrics. It's very commonly done. And statistics, you hear usually parse it out that way. So we found that the average A1C that the device achieved was about 7.1% in adults and about 7.5% in the kids.
That's pretty amazing, actually.
It's a really good A1C, and we did not increase hypoglycemia relative to the standard of care. And I think it's important to emphasize that the way we designed our trial was to have a standard of care study arm. So not everybody who went into the trial used the iLet right away. So what happened was there was a randomization. You were screened into the trial, and when you were enrolled, you would randomize to either the iLet, which is called the intervention arm, or the standard of care arm. And by standard of care, we mean whatever your insulin therapy was when you came into the trial, do that, but do it with a G6 Dexcom. Now, if you were, for instance, using a CGM already, then we don't need to bother introducing a G6 Dexcom. If you use the Medtronic, then that's your standard of care. You've got CGM, and we give you a blinded G6 Dexcom because we want to capture all the data on G6. Mm-hmm. If you're using a Eversense or a Libre, continue doing that, but we'll give you a blinded G6. And if you didn't use any CGM, we taught you how to use a CGM if you went into the control arm, into the standard of care arm, and they became a CGM user, at least for that 13-week period. So the study cohort divided across these two groups. And because we had a standard of care arm, we could keep track of how well people did in the trial on their own care. And people tend to do better in clinical trials than they do on their own because they're being watched, you interact with them more. It's called a study effect, the Hawthorne effect. And so we want to keep track of that. And whatever the iLet does, it's really the difference between how much you subtract out the improvement the standard of care arm saw from the improvement the iLet saw relative to baseline. Mm-hmm. And that difference is the difference in the improvement of the iLet. You can quantify the improvement. And what we found was that it was statistically significant reduction in HbA1c of 0.5% relative to standard of care. So we saw a 0.5% improvement in mean in A1C relative to standard of care on the Islet. And that was a statistically significant difference, which means that the likelihood that happened to chance is exceedingly small.
How about if you take I heard the pride in your voice when you said how you chose, the people to go through these testings. And I feel like I understand the underpinning of that, which is that some companies pick ringers, like people who they know are gonna do a good job, right? How many times, how much data do you have about people coming in with just wildly out of control A1Cs, 11s, 12s? Did it bring them to a 7?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. So we were very careful not to have an upper limit on HbA1c, and that's unprecedented. There's never been an AID study where there wasn't a limit on upper limit on HbA1c, a pivotal trial. Mm-hmm. So we, for a market application for a device. And so we were really clear about this. We wanted to make sure that no more than a fifth. We asked the sites to limit those people that you randomize such that the limit or fill certain buckets. So make sure that at least a third of them have an A1C above 8%, and no more than a fifth have an A1C below 7. And that's because these large epidemiological studies out there, like the T1D Exchange and other studies, have shown that typically in the US, all these studies tend to corroborate that only about 1 in 5 people meet the American Diabetes Association goal for therapy of an A1C below 7. Yeah. That it just continues to ring true, at least adults. Kids are even worse, unfortunately. They're having worse outcomes. But adults 18 and older, it's about 1 in 5 are achieving goal, and 80% aren't. So we wanted to make sure our cohort, as much as possible, reflected that. So we asked the sites to try and limit the enrollment of people with A1C below 7, and to make sure you had at least a third with A1C above 8. We also wanted to make sure that at least a third of the cohort was on MDI at baseline.
Right.
So we didn't take pump users, as exclusive requirement. We allowed people who are on pumps and people who are on hybrid closed-loop systems to participate in the trial. So if it was an FDA cleared device or an FDA approved device, it was admissible into the study.
Yeah, I feel that. When you mentioned it earlier, it struck a chord with me because, somebody asked me recently about, how do you stay so motivated about making the podcast? And I was like, for all the people I reach, it's a very small percentage of people who have diabetes. And, those other people are not running around with A1Cs in the 6s. They're overwhelmed. They don't understand what they're doing. They've long past given up, and they're on a ride with their eyes closed, wondering when it's going to come to a stop. And I
think the Islet is for those people. The Islet is for most of those people. Mm-hmm. It's not for everybody. And on one end of the spectrum, right, as I was trying to emphasize, the knob turners who are going to have anxiety by giving up control and can't get past that, it's not for them. And there are therapies. Fortunately, we have so many good alternatives now. There are therapies for them. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have to at least, you have to tend to what Stephen Russell calls the care and feeding of the device. You have to make sure there's insulin in the cartridge. You have to make sure the CGM is streaming data. You have to make sure the infusion set is intact and working, right? And you have to make sure the battery is charged. Yeah. So that is a care and feeding level of responsibility that's essential for the Islet to help you. Mm-hmm. And there are going to be some people who won't do that either, and also couldn't for reasons like you can't be pregnant and use it. I would imagine because it's not indicated for pregnancy. We did not test it in pregnancy, so that would have to be done, separately as another trial. Are there reasons that a doctor couldn't write it off label at some point for somebody under 6, or are you going to have to do that testing before that gets okayed? Oh, physicians can do pretty much anything they want with off-label usage. They can use these devices, not just ours, but any of these devices off-label. We just can't train to that, and we just need to be very clear what is on-label. Yeah, and what is on-label is people with type 1 diabetes who are 6 and above. Okay, who are and not pregnancy. So that's certainly not something we have an indication for use. So for clarity, I can't use Islet and achieve a 5.5 A1C. There's no way for me to manipulate it or do that kind of stuff without lows? Good question. So I noticed one of your from some of your users had some of your listeners had a question similar to that. So what we found is about 46% of our adults had a mean glucose after 13 weeks on the Islet of about 100. About 46% had a mean glucose under 154, and an A1C of 7% corresponds to a mean glucose of about 154. Yeah. So at 46% of the cohort had a mean glucose below below 154. About 27% of the cohort on the Islet had an A1C below 7. So almost a third. So what does that mean? What was the lowest A1C in the Islet? It was in the 5s, by the way. So we did have somebody who was 13 weeks on the Islet, and they ended with an A1C sort of in the mid 5s. But it's unusual. The Islet tries to bring people's mean glucose and A1C up a little higher. If you're sitting down at a mean glucose of 110 or 120,
right,
you're likely going to see it increase toward 130 or 140 or 150. So, and it is that increase that some of those folks who enjoy being down there, maybe they pay a price of hypoglycemia, but they want to be down there, skimming the trees, so to speak, will be frustrated by that rise. But the reality is, all the clinical data suggests that there's no advantage to an A1C of 5.5 over an A1C of 6.5. There's almost no signal for microvascular damage below an A1C of 7, which is why these societies like the Endocrine Society and the American Diabetes Association have these goals for therapy.
So nuts and bolts. I want to go over just how it works for a second. So
yeah,
I'm going to eat a meal. Am I right? Like, I probably should just ask you, but my understanding of it is, and I'm assuming if this is my loose understanding, it's about a lot of other people's. I announce the meal by saying this is breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And then I say whether this is similar, smaller, or larger than I'm accustomed to eating. Is that it?
That's it.
Okay.
So even rolling the tapes back further still, to start the Islet on day 0, right? You get on the Islet, you enter your body weight. Mm-hmm. And that is it, right? So there's no programming of basal rates. There's no programming of insulin correction factors. There's no programming of carb to insulin ratios. And there's no carb counting specifically, right? We do ask that you be carb aware, and I'll make a mention of that in a moment. But so to start the system, you enter your body weight. You have to learn how to hook up the infusion set and pair it with the CGM and so forth. But then you enter your body weight, and then you go bionic. And then you swipe to go bionic. And the system starts dosing every 5 minutes of every day and adjusts insulin therapy according to your needs, to your ever-changing insulin needs. But the meal announcement works as you described almost exactly.
Okay.
But to give you a little bit of color under the hood as to what's actually happening when you do that. So with the meal announcement, you just simply you swipe to unlock the device, and you just press on the little knife and fork. There's a little knife and fork here, and you press on that, and it asks you, is this, what meal type is it? And you get to bucket it, breakfast, lunch, or dinner. So given the time of day, I'm going to choose, let's just say, well, it depends on where you are. Let's just say I choose dinner. And then it asks you, is this usual carbs for me, more or less? So 3 buckets and no numbers, mind you, right? Mm-hmm. This is diabetes without numbers. As a primary care physician that we've been working with for years, who was really the one who coined that. And then you just simply, once you say, usual for me, for instance, let's choose usual for me, then you just swipe, and it then determines the dose at that moment, and it begins to deliver. So what happens is it gives a dose of insulin at that moment. So if you have the food delivered, you don't pre-meal bolus. We discourage that. We ask people to wait until the food is in front of you, not to worry about fat and protein, right? Just focus on the carbohydrates on your plate. And by that, I mean, is this lump of rice the usual amount of carbohydrate I'd have for my lunch, say, or my breakfast or my dinner? And it will then, on the very first offering of a meal announcement, say for your first lunch meal announcement that you issue, it'll give a bolus at that moment. Once you say usual for me lunch, for example, it'll give a bolus based on your body weight initially. And it'll be quite conservative on that first attempt. And then it will watch every 5 minutes of the rest of the day, how much, what your glucose does, and it will add insulin as needed or suspend insulin as needed. And we have 2 other controllers that are running separate from the meal announcement controller, the one that gives that bolus up front. One we call the basal controller or the basal algorithm, and the other algorithm we call the corrections algorithm. And they're working in concert every 5 minutes, and they adapt on multiple timescales to your changing needs. But the correction algorithm will add insulin above and beyond what the basal algorithm thinks you need for your basal requirement. And if it sees the blood sugar start to rise, even in the face of that meal announcement bolus that was just delivered, the correction algorithm will add some additional insulin. And tomorrow, when you issue another meal announcement for, say, lunch, a usual for me, it will look to see yesterday when you did this, the meal announcement gave 3 units of insulin, and then we added another 3 units of insulin, of correction insulin, in the 4 hours afterwards. And that was not the right balance. It wants the meal announcement to be a majority of your mealtime insulin over the 4 hours after the meal announcement. And if it was short of that, it'll make it a little bigger. The next day you do it, or a little bit smaller if it was too much, if it was all of the insulin. And then it'll start adapting that. And the body weight thing becomes less important. You initialized it with body weight, but it's allowed to depart from that very quickly and start adjusting the size of that lunch meal announcement to be to account for most of your 4-hour insulin, but not all of it. And it separately adapts the meal announcement for breakfast, separate from lunch, separate from dinner, and it buckets those three. And if you have a snack, if you have an evening snack, you might want to bucket that with dinner. If you have a morning snack, a little 11 o'clock-ish, like Winnie the Pooh, you might call that a breakfast snack.
Okay.
Right.
Why doesn't it need a pre-bolus? Is it because, I've used a number of different algorithms with my daughter, most specifically Loop and Omnipod 5. And they seem to have in common that once you put in insulin, they take away basal and then work backwards is kind of how I think about it. Does that make sense?
It does,
are you staying?
I understand that.
Is the Islet staying aggressive when the bolus goes in? Because my daughter can't eat food without pre-bolusing. Like whether I did it, so what is it doing? Is it matching the power of the rise with insulin and then getting the hell out of there before it causes a low? Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah. So what it does is the basal controller is a control that adapts on multiple timescales. So let's just focus on that one first, the basal algorithm, we call it. And it has, it's adjusting sort of an average basal rate that it figures out by itself over time. And there's an ability of the basal algorithm to shut basal insulin off completely if you're starting to go low. If you are low or you're tending low, it can turn the basal insulin dosing off completely.
Right.
But it's adjusting this on a very short time scale, looking at your glucose levels every 5 minutes. It's got to be very responsive. I'm going to turn off basal insulin if you're dropping too fast or if you're low. Or it can just run along, and it also can see daily patterns. So it also adapts on a diurnal nocturnal time scale of 24 hours. And so it can see that, if suppose you're a child who has growth hormone secretion upon the onset of sleep at around 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock at night, and they tend to need more insulin because of that, because the growth hormone causes, release of glucose by the liver. And so the basal control will start to see that, and it'll start to adapt upwards. And it might see this pattern that typically around this hour of the day, I need more basal insulin. It'll just it'll see that pattern and it'll reinforce it. But if you change as you grow into a young child and then a teenager, and you start having a cortisol secretion just before waking in the dawn hours, and you no longer have the growth hormone at night, now that shifts toward you're needing more basal insulin, say at 5 a.m, it'll figure that out automatically. And similarly with intercurrent illness. So if you have an upper respiratory virus and you see a sudden need for more basal insulin or more correction insulin for 2 or 3 days, it'll see that automatically and realize that I've got to give more insulin to keep the glucose down at this average that I've been trying to achieve. So I will adapt upwards for that 2 or 3 or 4 days or a week when you're more insulin resistant. And if you have a vomiting illness and you're very insulin sensitive, it'll do the opposite. It'll back off and become less aggressive. So it's doing, the basal controller is doing that, the basal algorithm. And the corrections algorithm is also figuring out your insulin sensitivity automatically, not in so much in terms of the number, what is your insulin sensitivity factor, but rather recognizing that this person over the days and weeks, months and years, their insulin resistance might change. They might need more insulin when your blood sugar hits 250 than it used to when you were 6 years old, than you need now when you're 14. And it'll suddenly start adjusting that upwards as well. And you'll get more correction insulin on top of it. And it adapts on multiple time scales, not just 5 minutes and daily time scales, but intermediate time scales as well. And that adapting on multiple time scales allows these two algorithms to learn. It's really a self-learning system. It allows that system to engage in what is essentially called lifelong learning. So it does see patterns on a daily basis, and it is able to adapt to your ever-changing insulin needs. Meal announcements adapt according to how you provide input on what is usual meal for you, breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
And you're comfortable calling it learning. It's not just going off of what it's seen recently, but it's remembering stuff from the past.
Yes, it is. And so it is storing information from this past week on where your insulin needs were higher and lower. So it is a kind of an autonomous learning system. I wouldn't call it artificial intelligence.
Right.
It does do some pattern recognition, though, in the sense that if it sees, that the basal algorithm is giving more insulin at this, early morning hours over and over again, it will see that, and it will it will tend to be higher in that period, unless for some reason in that particular morning you don't secrete the cortisol and you're more insulin sensitive. It can very quickly turn off the basal insulin automatically. So it is a learning system in that regard.
Yeah. So that brings up a question that a lot of people asked, and that I was wondering just while you were talking. Use an idea like somebody getting their period. Like, so one day, like, I'll use my daughter because I'm sure one day she'll love to listen back to this podcast and hear her period discussed this much. But in the days approaching, Arden can need more insulin. And then when the event happens, she can fairly suddenly need less. And it changes dress. So can I just like whisper in the Islet's ear, like, I got my period, or like how does that, like, because you can't tell it stuff like that, right?
No, you can't tell it stuff like that. And it doesn't have memory over a monthly cycle, right? It's really looking more over seeing patterns in the past week or so. But just to be clear, the Islet learns and adapts very, very quickly. So what we found was in the pivotal trial, remember, we start the system with your body weight. So imagine you have a teenager, a raging hormone adolescent who weighs 70 kilos and uses 90 units of insulin a day, and an adult who weighs 70 kilos who uses 45. The Islet will figure out that difference in about 24 to 48 hours. That difference, that's fast, right? Yeah. That's fast enough to handle the increased insulin demand around periods, around intercurrent illness. The physiological changes in insulin demand happen over the space of a day or so. It will see that. And if you suddenly become very insulin sensitive, like you just described, it can shut basal insulin off and it won't dose correction insulin if it doesn't need it, if you're not hyperglycemic. So if it sees you sort of staying low, it'll back off completely on basal insulin or shut it down dramatically so that you won't go low as easily as you can go high. Okay. So it definitely is biased in trying to prevent hypoglycemia. That's like the first order of business, is to limit hypoglycemia.
How does that work with exercise?
So with exercise, I would like to introduce you to the idea of a bihormonal system, right? That is indeed unequivocally the best way to deal with exercise, is to be as biomimetic as possible. That is how the pancreas handles exercise. It reduces insulin secretion simultaneously with increasing glucagon secretion. And we really do need a bihormonal system to handle exercise elegantly in type 1. All single hormone systems are vulnerable to exercise, even insulin pen therapy, all of it.
Yeah.
So you have carbohydrates to help and other tricks to deal with that, using carbs, maybe carbs to treat, or being fasted going into exercise, or different ways to deal with it. People have different ideas about that. And many of those tools are going to be used with the single hormone Islet. But specifically, disconnecting from the device is what we recommend if you're going to engage in exercise. Just disconnect at the infusion set. If you're going to engage in exercise where you find yourself going low on your other therapies, try disconnecting from the Islet. There's no setting of temporary basals. But if you do have to go beyond that and say it's not enough just to suspend insulin, I also need to usually take some carbs ahead of exercise. If you're going to carb load like that to prevent hypos during workouts, what we ask you to do is to disconnect from the Islet first and then take the carbohydrates, not the other way around. Because if you do the carb loading and forget to disconnect and you work out, it'll see the rise and it'll start dosing just when you don't want it, when you're working out. So the order is actually important there. And that's something that's a little different from traditional pump therapy.
Okay. Would you say that the system, if it's trying to address a higher blood sugar, for example, does it address it with basal insulin or with a bolus?
Yeah, so it has the correction algorithm is responsible for giving insulin above and beyond what the basal sees its responsibility to be. So the basal insulin algorithm is sort of swimming in its own swim lane. And then you've got the correction algorithm that swims in its swim lane. And when you start to have hyperglycemic excursions, for whatever reason, stress hormones, stress, whatever, intercurrent illness, or carbohydrates, right? If you forget to meal announce, or even if you do meal announce, you tend to see still a rise after that. The corrections algorithm's responsibility is to come in and give that additional insulin above and beyond basal that handles hyperglycemic excursions. Okay. And if you forgot to meal announce, it will provide all of the additional meal insulin, if you will. It doesn't know it's meal insulin, it's just correction insulin needed to bring you back into range. But if you do forget to meal announce, it will step up and do that. What we tell people is that what we've seen is that typically if you forget to meal announce and you eat a meal and it has a sufficient amount of carbs to cause a glucose excursion, you'll typically you'll likely go higher than you would if you did a meal announcement. You'll be higher for longer. And there is an increased chance of late postprandial hypoglycemia if you don't do the meal announcement, because the meal announcement gets the insulin up front.
Yeah.
It's always best to get the insulin up front than to wait until you see the rise.
Right.
But it is designed to handle glucose excursions when, of any sort, even those occasions when you forget to meal announce.
Okay. So here's another idea. What if I'm a very low carb person and I weigh 150 pounds and I put on iLet and I say, I weigh 150 pounds and I'm eating breakfast and it's normal for me. But normal is 3 eggs and 2 slices of bacon and a half a piece of
right.
toast. What happens then?
Great question. So as I said, with the meal announcement, all we're asking you to do is be what we call carb aware. Meaning, know what the difference is between the 3 macronutrients. Know what a fat, a protein, and a carbohydrate are, right? You should, that's every person should know that, whether you have diabetes or not. Everybody should have that level of nutritional education. So with the iLet, we expect that level of nutritional education, and we provide educational materials in our training documents to help understand some of the macronutrition, some basic nutritional guidelines. But essentially, understanding that, if you're eating eggs and bacon for your breakfast and you're having no carbohydrate, there's no meal announcement to be had. It doesn't matter if there's 80 calories on that plate, right? Or
right.
Whatever, hundreds of calories on that plate, 150, 300, 500 calories. If there's no carbohydrate in it, there's no need for a meal announcement. Suppose you're a grazer and you never have more than what we typically say for adults, if you're having fewer carbs than is in a single slice of bread, then there's no need to meal announce. That's just a rule of thumb. Again, we like to stay away from numbers, but for an adult, you might think of a piece of bread or anything less than that. You can probably just skip the meal announcement and let the corrections algorithm do the rest. So for small snacks or meals where you have very low carbohydrate, you wouldn't meal announce.
Where would I expect my blood sugar to go in a scenario like that?
Of course it varies, but if you had a very low carbohydrate meal, you could see an excursion. You could see a small excursion to 100, 200 to 200 mg per deciliter, and the correction algorithm could kick in and then bring you back down.
Okay.
If you had a very high carb meal, like suppose you had 120 grams of carbs, right? If you're a teenager having a big bowl of cereal in the morning, it's not unreasonable to see your glucose go to 250 or 300. Even with the meal announcement, because it takes time, because we do encourage people to do it at the site of the meal, but not before. And by the way, if you forget the meal announcement and it's been more than 30 minutes since you started the meal, we ask you not to do a meal announcement then. Just let it go. Let the corrections algorithm do it. But it isn't unreasonable for your glucose to go to 250 or 300 if you have a very large carbohydrate load, even with a meal announcement. Gotcha. But then the correction algorithm will kick in and take care of that.
And I couldn't say have a breakfast that I call normal and then realize oh hell, it was larger than. Can I go back and tell it hey, that was a large breakfast? Or do I tell?
No, what you would do is, the way you would try and deal with that is, suppose you have a breakfast and then you want to have or dinner and a dessert, right? Yeah. Or a meal. Let's get it out of the category of breakfast, just in general. If you have a meal and you look at what's in front of you now, estimate, is this usual, more or less than usual for me? And so in what's in front of you now, I'm going to clean my plate. I estimate I'll clean my plate. Let's do usual for me and swipe. And then it'll give that meal dose, and it'll start watching your blood sugar rise. Now, let's say 45 minutes later, you're going to have a dessert. And dessert comes and it's got more carbs than the meal. Then you could add, right at that moment, you could say more than usual as another, because it's like another meal. And you can just stack it right on, attach it to that. It's not stacking, because you really do need that insulin. So you're attaching one meal announcement to another, and they're separated by, say, 30 or 45 minutes, whatever it is, between the time you get your primary meal and you get your dessert. So desserts can very often be more than usual because they very often are carb rich. So you shouldn't resist. You'd still call it, say you're having a dinner and you have a usual for me dinner, typical amount of carbs, and then the dessert comes and it's 50% or 75% more than your carbs than you'd have in the dinner you just swiped for. You then swipe for a more than usual dinner as your dessert.
Okay. I'm going to look through a couple of these questions here.
Sure.
Do you have an idea of what it would cost out of pocket once it's available?
Out of pocket? Or do you mean with insurance?
No, if I didn't have insurance, then I would have to pay cash.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have?
Yeah, I do think. Yes, you can. You can buy. Buy. We have one of our distributors that allows you to buy direct if you were to do a cash pay.
Okay.
So yeah, I think it's very, very similar to the price you might pay for an insulin, a durable insulin pump.
Okay.
So several $1,000s is what you'd expect to pay for out of pocket cash pay, and you would purchase that not directly from Beta, but we have like 8 or 10 distributors that we're working with. There'd be one distributor you would go to do a cash pay, and there's a special price for that. And you can, if you're in a warranty and you want to get out, you can do a cash pay. Again, it's important to know we do have the 90-day return policy, and that's important for people to find out if they can live well with the Islet or if it's not the right device for them.
And it's covered by a wider range of insurances.
It is.
And what kind of a hell is that setting up on the business side? People to go out and knock on insurance company doors, and
I mean, it's a dedicated team, right? First of all, we have a dedicated team, a market access team at Beta for helping people with reimbursement. But the way we started this is through what's called the DME channel, the Durable Medical Equipment channel.
Right.
And through the DME channel, you have distributors across the country, and each distributor has set up contracts with all the commercial payers. So they had that, they're like a buffer for us. So they've had all those conversations. And similarly, CMS can go through those distributors as well once we have our contract with CMS set up. So we will sell through distributors at launch. We do also, we're very interested in getting into the pharmacy channel as well, which we think is in our future. And we have several reasons why we think that makes a lot of sense and is best for people with diabetes as well as providers. But for now and at launch, it's all through the DME channel.
Okay. Infusion sets, just one, or there are options?
We have one steel set at launch and one Teflon set. They're both 90-degree, 6 millimeter, and they're made by Unimedical. So we are using the Unimedical family of infusion sets. So if you're familiar with the terminology, we have the Inset 1, which is 6 millimeter, 23-inch tubing to the Islet cartridge, and we have the contact detach for the Teflon set and the contact detach for the steel set, which is a 90-degree, I think it's a 6 millimeter, 29 gauge steel set.
So you said something earlier that is not leaving my head, so I'm gonna have to ask about it. If I sit down at a burger joint and I have a cheeseburger and French fries, and I go, okay, the roll's 30, and I'll even throw in 5 more for the burger just in case, and the fries are 80 carbs, so it's 120 carbs. But I know for certain that 90 minutes from now, when my digestion slows down and that fat slows everything down, I'm going to see a rise up to 220 if I don't bolus for the fat. How does it deal with that?
Right. So you're invoking this idea of a square wave bolus or something, where it's been a very complicated way. With a traditional pump, you'd think about saying, well, let's release some of the insulin now, and then later I want more insulin to come in a second wave. Gastric emptying happens over a long period of time.
Right.
Because of the fat and the protein, slowing that. Well, remember what I said at the beginning, we have 2 other algorithms besides the meal announcement algorithm that are running every 5 minutes of every day. It's like a perpetual square wave bolus ready to be let loose if needed, but only if needed.
Okay.
So it's watching you every 5 minutes. And suppose what happens is the meal announcement comes in and some of the carbs are released quickly, and you see this rise, and the meal announcement insulin catches up to it, and you start coming down and you drop to say 170. And now you're at like 2 hours out and you're down to 120, and suddenly you start to rise. The basal control is just chugging away. The corrections algorithm is watching you. It's like a hawk every 5 minutes. Now suddenly you start drifting up to 150, 160, 170. It starts adding insulin, saying, basal, this is out of your league. I'm coming in to take over. And so the correction algorithm comes in and starts adding insulin without you having to pay attention to any of that, because it shouldn't be your job to do that.
Is that stream thinking they just ate 3 hours ago? This is probably a reoccurrence, or does it not care?
It has no opinions.
It just sees it sees a number,
no judgments and no opinions.
It sees a number and it goes, no.
Yeah.
Okay.
All it cares about is your glucose at the moment, and it uses its past insulin history with you. It's learnings from that history and your current glucose level and the amount of insulin that is pending. It's keeping track of all the insulin that's pending every 5 minutes and updating that itself.
So it boluses the number it sees, not a predictive trend. It's not.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, we use something called model predictive control. So it does make an estimate of what the glucose is going to be in 5 minutes from now, the next step. And then it will update its estimate of that at the next step once it sees the real value and compares it to the model. But that's it. It's just it's a 5-minute prediction on what your glucose is going to be. But importantly, it keeps track of the very long horizon to the future of your insulin tail, because every dose it gives, it keeps track of how long that dose takes to rise and peak in your blood, which is usually about an hour, and 6 more hours before that insulin I'm giving right now is really mostly gone. Yeah. And then 5 minutes later, it gives another dose, and it superimposes that insulin rise and fall profile, and it has that insulin to look forward to. It's what we call pending insulin action. Yeah. It's accounting for that and predicting what your glucose is going to be in the next 5 minutes.
When I talk to people in person, when I do in-person talks, I explain to them about there's different levels of, or different lines of insulin happening all the time. You put in some here, the basal is hitting, peaking, and tailing, and then the basal from 5 minutes later is hitting. You can't keep it all straight in your head, right? But so is every bolus. And if you really think about it like that, there's these constant pushes. It's fantastic that an algorithm can like make quick sense of that.
And that's what that's all it does. Like, it's really good at this very narrow task. It's much better than we are, the vast majority of right? It is much better than that because it's got one very narrow job. We do many things very, very well, but the vast majority of us can't do what the iLet can do because it's its only job. And it's doing it every 5 minutes. It doesn't have anything to distract it. Yeah. So that's all it really cares about. And so it keeps track of every one of those doses, and it literally superimposes those doses one on top of the other to account for how much insulin is trailing off and how much is rising.
It's got a cartridge, right, in it for insulin?
Yes.
How much does it hold?
It's a 180 unit cartridge. And after you prime the tubing, you'll have about 160 units. Mm-hmm. So we found it lasted about 3 days in the average adult.
Okay. But if I just get somebody to write me a script for more. And so I've never,
right.
I'm going to sound odd for a second. I've never used a tube pump. So my daughter's been using exclusively Omnipod since she was 4. But you just pop out that cartridge, put a new one in, prime it, and keep going.
Correct. So let me tell you 2 things about that cartridge. One is we have 2 different types of cartridge. Mm-hmm. One is a patient fillable cartridge. So it's a glass cartridge, 1.8 ml, and you can put Humalog or Novolog in it through the septum. You can just draw it out of a vial like you would with your Omnipod into a syringe, and then introduce the syringe needle into the septum of the little cartridge, which looks just like the septum on your insulin vial. Yeah. And then you introduce the insulin in, remove the bubbles, and then you load the filled cartridge into the iLet chamber, quarter turn of the iLet connector and tubing to the iLet, and then it'll prime some of the tubing, and then you prime the rest of it and hook it up to your set. The other thing I want to tell you about is that in the pivotal trial, we used Humalog and Novolog in the adults in the randomized controlled trial, but we also had a cohort of adults use Fiasp in a pre-filled cartridge that Novo Nordisk makes, which is identical in shape and size to our patient-filled cartridge, ready-to-fill cartridge, and it's filled in a blister. It comes in a blister pack of 5 cartridges, and it's pre-filled with Fiasp. And so that dispenses with the need to transfer insulin from a vial and pull out the air bubble. That process takes about 5 minutes or so. We eliminate that. So with the pre-fill cartridge in the trial, you just popped it out of the blister package, slide it into the chamber at quarter turn, and you prime the tubing. You can change a cartridge soup to nuts, a pre-filled cartridge, Fiasp cartridge, in less than 60 seconds with the iLet, because it's got a very fast motor drivetrain like the Animas pump did, for those of your listeners who are familiar with that. So we emulate that very fast movement of the rewind and then advancing and priming. Mm-hmm. You can do a less than a 60-second change if it's a pre-fill cartridge.
Did you notice any better outcomes with Fiasp over other insulins?
Not much. One thing I'll say is that in almost every analysis we did, it was very similar to Humalog and Novolog in the adults, 18 and older. And what we found was that in every way, it had very low levels of hypoglycemia, like similar to standard of care, like we saw with the Humalog Novolog. Its mean glucose was very similar. The A1C was similar. Time in range was similar, 71% with Fiasp versus 69% in the adults for Humalog Novolog. But we did see a statistically significant improvement in time in range. It improved by 14% relative to standard of care, relative to Humalog Novolog iLet users, which saw an 11% improvement in time in range. So that was statistically significant, but it's not sure. I'm not sure that's clinically relevant, right, but it was a little better. And one thing I'll add to that, we didn't tell the iLet it was Fiasp, right? So we have hard-coded in the iLet knowledge about insulin kinetics. Now, we know that Fiasp in the aggregate is absorbed more quickly in most adults, or in the aggregate of a cohort of adults than Humalog or Novolog, and it clears a little faster. So it's a slightly faster drug. And if that information had been provided to the Islet, we have some pre-pivotal studies that showed you might see better glucose control, lower mean glucose, higher time in range with Fiasp than Humalog, Novolog. But for this study, we talked to the FDA about it. We didn't have enough data to go into a pivotal trial and adjust the built-in parameters in the device to let it know that Fiasp is faster. So it was under the assumption, operated under the assumption that it was just like Humalog, Novolog. And so it didn't get to leverage the faster kinetics. Mm-hmm. It was in the mathematics that's built into the device. In the future, we'll visit that possibility, but we didn't see big differences, and probably just because we couldn't tell it was faster.
Okay. Should people hear that those are the only insulins they can use and think that that's the case, or can they use you can't tell them to use it off label, but is something horrible going to happen if they put a Pedra in it or something like that, as an example?
Well, we didn't test it with a Pedra. Mm-hmm. We did test it in adults with Humalog, Novolog, and Fiasp. And one thing I didn't mention is that when people who randomized to the standard of care arm in the pivotal trial for 13 weeks, they kind of drew the short straw. I mean, they wanted to be in the trial to test the Islet, but they ended up randomizing to their own care. So what we did was, those people had the option, who randomized to standard of care, to spend 13 weeks on the Islet after the study ended. Mm-hmm. So they could cross over the Islet. And the vast majority of them did just that. And when the kids crossed over, they all used Fiasp in the pre-filled cartridge. And we saw very similar results to what we saw with the adults with Fiasp. Okay. So what we have right now in front of the FDA is an application to get the pre-filled Fiasp cartridge approved for use with the Islet, and that's going through the process right now. So we're hopeful that will come through soon. But right at launch, it's cleared for use of Humalog and Novolog in our patient-filled cartridge.
Right. A couple of ideas around you being a smaller company. So people ask questions like, there's the diehard Omnipod people that are like, look, if it's got tubing, I don't want it. Can they make one without tubing? Can they get it for kids under 6? Can they? Do you have the bandwidth to can they, or where are you at?
Yeah, I mean, we do have limited bandwidth, but we're very creative about some of the things we can do. Like, for instance, because we came from an academic realm, myself and Stephen Russell in the early days of the project, we do try and think creatively about ways to bring financial resources into the company to help us do trials that might give us indications for use for other kinds of conditions, right? Other kinds of diabetes, and so forth, and different age groups and things like that. So what we have done is we've worked with other investigators who are in academia, like ourselves, and they can put in grant proposals to the Helmsley Charitable Trust, the JDRF, the National Institutes of Health, to get funding for studies, now that the Islet's FDA cleared, to test it in other indications. And so our hope is that we can work collaboratively with academic institutions and clinical investigators like ourselves to do those studies. Instead of it being Stephen and Ed's teams doing those trials, we're now going to work with other investigators like ourselves to do that in the academic realm. So we can leverage all that financial resource that comes from private foundations and government funding. Money doesn't come into Beta, but then Beta doesn't have to spend the money to do those trials. So that's how we hope to get expanded indications.
Okay.
At this time at least. And then, as the company gets more resourced, then maybe we could do some sponsored studies as well. But we're limited in what we can do outside of, we really want to get the bihormonal pivotal trial started, because we're very committed to bringing the bihormonal Islet to people with type 1.
I want to get to that. I have a couple more questions first.
Of course.
So I don't know anything about what you did. Like, I don't have technical knowledge. Did you decide we're going to shoot for a 7A1C, or is that what the algorithm is capable of? Like, were there 4 dials you could have turned and you'd be on here telling me, oh, it keeps people around a 6A1C and you spike to about 180, not too, like, you know what I mean? Like, or is that not the case?
Yeah. So the way we did this is we started by studying the bihormonal system, and we chose a glucose target, and aggressiveness factors and things like that initially. And then, and we did these studies first in the inpatient center at MGH, just with the bihormonal system, once we started human trials. And after a while, it became clear to us that with the bihormonal system, occasionally the glucagon channel might not be available. Mm-hmm. And so what happens if the glucagon runs out while you're out and about? Or what happens if you have an occlusion or your glucagon infusion set fails? then if that happens, it needs to sort of fall back safely into an a single hormone insulin only configuration. And we hadn't really tested what that looks like. We weren't back then thinking about making a single hormone iLet as a product, right? We were thinking about this being a fallback. And so we started doing studies testing the bihormonal bionic pancreas against the single hormone bionic pancreas against standard of care. And what we found was the single hormone bionic pancreas was a very differentiated technology in its own right. It couldn't, but it had to, all of its glucose targets had to go up higher to be able to get really good glucose control and not have hypoglycemia. And so we started studying different glucose set points for the insulin only system and for the bihormonal system. And with single hormone, we found you could safely have these targets up here and not have much hypoglycemia. And with the bihormonal ones, we could safely have these targets down here and still not have hypoglycemia because glucagon is helping that. So we could basically have effectively something that could give a little bit more insulin up front, a little bit more aggressively, just because the targets are lower that it operates under with the bihormonal. And so that's how we came to figuring out what these targets were. So the A1C that it gets, or the mean glucose that it achieves, was really, it fell out of the mix. We weren't shooting for a particular target of, is it going to be able to get 154? We said, what does this system do, configured this way with this target? What is the average a cohort will get on the system? And we found out with the single hormone, it was about 155 in adults. And the bihormonal in adults was more like 140. So there's about 15 mg per deciliter improvement by adding that second hormone and being able to use these lower targets. With single hormone, as you lower the target, every time you lower the target, you see a lowering in the mean glucose, but a concomitant increase in time below 54. With the bihormonal system, we saw as you lowered the target, you saw a progressive improvement or lowering of mean glucose without an increase in hypoglycemia, but with an increase in glucagon usage.
Okay.
So we exchanged hypoglycemia for slightly increased in glucagon infusion. And so we can keep these lower targets safely.
So when you get to a dual chamber at some point and you're doing glucagon and insulin, what do you think you'll be back on here telling people about their outcomes?
Oh, so what we've seen as I mentioned, what we've seen in all of our pre-pivotal studies that we published over the years is a mean glucose that is about 15 mg per deciliter lower than what we saw with the Islet pivotal trial, which would correspond to about 0.5% lower A1C.
140.
And as you may recall, I said about almost half the people had a mean glucose below 154 on the single hormone Islet of the adults. What we see is that about 90% of people on the bihormonal system have a mean glucose below 154 adults. So it's a big difference in terms of bringing more people under the
and it's going to become increasingly unlikely that you experience a low. And what are we calling a low, by the way? You said in range a couple times. Is that 70 to 180?
70 to 180 is what we're calling in range.
Okay. And so
that's time in range.
A low is 69?
Oh, no. So yes, certainly that's out of range. So that's below range.
Right.
So we measure we keep track of two metrics in our pivotal trial studies. We had an outcome that looked at what percentage of time do you spend below 70 and what percentage of time do you spend below 54. And the way we powered the study was we said that, we powered the study statistically for superiority. We expected to see a superior outcome in HbA1c. In reduction of HbA1c. So we thought we'd have superiority in A1C relative to standard of care and non-inferiority in time below 54 relative to standard of care. And that's exactly what we found in the trial.
Yeah, I feel like I haven't just expressed enough how pretty amazing it is, just the meal announcement portion of it. Like, I can't imagine what a relief that must be to people. Did you talk to them about that in exit surveys and things
we
like that?
We did. Excellent question. So we had focus groups at the end of the trial. So we worked with Jill Weisberg-Benchel. She's up in Chicago and she works at the Lurie Children's Hospital. And so she's an expert in psychosocial and behavioral outcomes when it comes to studying diabetes technologies. So she developed validated behavioral and psychosocial tests, questionnaires that we gave throughout the study, and also ran the focus groups at the end for people as they came off the device. So that was qualitative. So we have these quantitative questionnaires, and then we have these qualitative focus groups at the end. So we did get to find out how people felt about things like diabetes distress, fear of hypoglycemia, but also just sort of qualitative measures of how people feel about the Islet. And I do think you're right about this giving up of carbohydrate counting, this diabetes without numbers, is really important to people, because we're trying to say that we really hope this device is agnostic to levels of literacy and numeracy, to levels of technical acumen, to socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity. And so we did a lot of work in the trial doing subgroup analyses. We published something in the New England Journal of Medicine after the main study was published in a letter to the editor, looking at these subgroup analyses to show that the people who needed the most improvement in glucose got it from the Islet, more so than people who were very close to range. Yeah. And so it didn't seem to discriminate against people if you were on MDI therapy and never used a pump versus people who are on hybrid closed loop. Didn't discriminate against people who had never used a CGM versus those who had. What you do see is the people of the highest baseline A1Cs at baseline before the study started saw the greatest improvement. And you'd mentioned, I imagine you're seeing people with higher A1Cs than other studies. Our highest A1C was 14.9 at baseline. Yeah. So we brought people in across the mix with, high A1Cs in the double digits.
Did that 14 leave at a 7?
6.8.
Oh, wow.
So the 14.9 went to 6.8. Yeah. That's anecdotal though. That's one data point, right? So we had other people at A1Cs, maybe of 9 that dropped to 8, 8.25, 8.5 or something like that. So it's not everybody sees that remarkable reduction, but it is noteworthy that some do.
Yeah.
And again, it's a device with, that you initialize with body weight and you use meal announcements without counting carbohydrates.
It's a very small barrier to entry, that's for sure. And I mean, obviously you're talking about like data that's at the end, this is the average, but not everybody achieved a 7, but it's still just worth bringing up that there's a 14 that came down that far is insane.
Yeah.
Do you think you'll get into other countries in any time soon, or is the U.S.?
Yeah, I think that it's quite surprising how things have changed through the pandemic. So it used to be that medtech companies would first target Europe, as you probably know, and diabetes medtech was no exception to that, where they would start in Europe, they'd get what's called a CE mark, and they'd start distributing in Europe. And then they would work their way into the U.S. with a big pivotal trial, and then they get FDA clearance. We're doing it the other way around. So we got FDA clearance first, launched in the U.S. first. The next step for us to come to Europe or other countries, OUS, will be a CE mark. What's happened through the pandemic is the CE mark process has really changed. It's a much longer process. It's taking a very long time to get regulatory clearance outside of the U.S. now. And it used to be quite the opposite. So it's certainly something we're going to pursue. Our goal at Beta Bionics is to bring this technology to as many people as possible, because it is a device that's made for as many people as possible. It's literally designed for that kind of uptake and that kind of broad demographic adoption. So we certainly want to get this out to OUS, to Europe, Middle East, and other countries, other regions. And that will require first a CE mark. So unfortunately, that will take a long time just from a regulatory process. It's certainly more than a year's worth of regulatory review.
Right.
But it's certainly something we're going to be doing.
I have a fair amount of Canadian listeners that'll be mad if I don't just say Canada like out loud.
Of course,
in front
you
of
have to say Canada out loud.
Yeah. So,
I mean, they are literally our next door neighbors. So we've got Canada and Mexico. We've got to get out there, right? Listen, and CE mark is the way to start.
You shouldn't have let all that smoke come down and choke me out, or I would have been a little more feeling about it. Okay, so like I told you before we started recording, when I first heard about this, I thought, my gosh, this is amazing, right? Like they're going to have glucagon in the same pump and, it's going to stop you from getting low. I have a couple of questions, and I'm assuming the major holdup was liquid stable glucagon. It had to exist in the pump for the amount of time, at least you were wearing it. So now that exists, and you have access to that. Great. So my first question is glucagon doesn't work if you're drunk. Is that right?
No, that isn't right. So we had looked into that specifically. So Stephen Russell did a clinical trial where he actually brought people into the clinical research center at MGH and got them drunk, IV though. So he actually got a protocol approved, and what he did was he could infuse alcohol intravenously and look at the efficacy of glucagon.
Okay.
That is microdose, not big rescue doses, right? We're giving tiny doses of glucagon.
Okay, I see.
Right. It's not basal glucagon. It's not like every 5 minutes you're going to get a dose of glucagon. It uses glucagon sparingly and only as needed. But the dose you might get at any step where it sees your blood sugar might be your CGM glucose might be dropping, or if you're already low, that dose could be 1% to 2% the size of a rescue dose. That's small. Okay. So tiny little doses. And he gave doses that were comparable to the doses we would give in the Bionic Pancreas, the Bihormonal Bionic Pancreas, and at different levels of blood alcohol levels in the clinical research center. And he was able to see that it was pretty much insensitive to the alcohol levels you'd likely see out in the wild. So let's put it that way.
so a rescue dose of glucagon might be different in that scenario, but the small amounts you were using were working.
Yeah, so he didn't test the rescue doses to see if that would be an issue, but definitely because the doses we're giving are so small, you're not depleting glycogen stores. Because what glucagon does is it breaks down stored glycogen in the liver, which is a stored form of glucose, breaks it down and it liberates glucose into the blood, and that's how it raises your blood sugar.
I'm asking this question way too ahead, but now we're into it already. So do you foresee the Islet being able to rescue if you're not drunk in a rescue situation? Like if it somehow thought this person's going to zero, would it go for it, or would it tell you?
It wouldn't release the whole cartridge, if that's what you mean, right? It wouldn't do that. And by the way, the amount of glucagon in this little tiny glucagon cartridge is much more than what you'd see in a rescue dose, because while it's a small cartridge, it's only 1 ml. Okay. So it's like, think of a cartridge with only 100 units of insulin. That's the size of this cartridge. It's really tiny. Mm-hmm. But the glucagon we're using, made by Zealand Pharma, is 4 times more concentrated than rescue glucagon.
Okay.
It's 4 mg per ml versus 1 mg per ml. So you wouldn't want to ever unload that whole thing. It's really about a 7-day supply of glucagon but by the way, the Islet uses it. Lasts about a week in that little cartridge. But what it would do is it wouldn't actually give a rescue dose, but it would continue to give glucagon doses every 5 minutes if it doesn't see your glucose coming back up. And remember, it also turns insulin off just like the single hormone Islet does.
Yeah, it would be
so it's using both. It's using the gas and the accelerator. I like to use that analogy of the insulin is like the gas and the brake is the, I shouldn't say gas and accelerator, a brake and accelerator. The insulin's like the accelerator and the glucagon's like the brake. And so you really want to take your foot off the accelerator and hit the brake if you want to slow down quickly. And with the bihormonal system, you have both at your disposal. Okay. So hopefully, the amount of glucagon that it can give should really prevent any need for rescue glucagon, as long as it's flowing into under the skin.
Is there an amount of time or a number of like little bumps with glucagon before, like, doesn't it eventually like just empty your liver and then there's just no more there anymore, right?
Yeah, and you're not going to get to a point with the bihormonal system where you'd get depleted unless you were very sick, right? So suppose you had a vomiting illness and you haven't been keeping anything down for a few days. You could get into a situation where you're depleted of glycogen stores, and then there's no substrate upon which glucagon can act if there's no glycogen stores. But it's hard to get to that state.
Yeah, I was going to say, and in that scenario, doesn't matter how you're managing, you'd probably be in the hospital one way or the other.
I think you're going to be finding your way into the hospital in that situation. But what we did see in our pre-pivotal studies is that you're, overnight, where you're getting just basal insulin overnight, so you're not having a ton of insulin, which helps store glycogen, and you're not eating at all, and you've been fasted for a very long time, so you've had no carbohydrates for 7 or 8 or 10 or 12 hours, right? Since you had your dinner and went to sleep. When they got up in the morning at 7 a.m. and they start becoming active and they might start going low, you'd see these little shots of glucagon, tiny little microdoses at 6 a.m. and 7 a.m. and it would pop them up. So that meant that even though they'd been fasted for 12 hours, they hadn't eaten anything, and they'd been getting very low levels of insulin, they still had plenty of glycogen upon which that glucagon could act.
Okay.
And so we never saw any depletion of glycogen storage, any evidence of that in any of the trials we did on a sort of routine day-to-day basis. But we've never studied, pushing it to the limit to see how many days could you go fasting before you'd run out of storage.
That's interesting.
That I don't know.
I just imagine that most people, I try hard, but I imagine most people think that rescue glucagon is like sugar that brings up your blood sugar, and they don't recognize that it actually signals your liver to, et cetera, and so on. Like, I don't know how well that's understood.
If it were up to me, I would, if it worked, which it wouldn't, I would rather push sugar than glucagon, because it doesn't have to rely on that secondary source of sugar in your liver that could be depleted when you're sick. But there's no way to infuse tiny amounts of sugar under the skin and have it do anything. We do use the hormone just the way the pancreas does. That's how the pancreas prevents hypoglycemia. It's your first line of defense. People without type 1, their first line of defense against hypoglycemia is glucagon. And we should not have the hubris to think that we can build a truly biomimetic closed loop system without adding glucagon back, because for people with type 1 diabetes, lose their ability to use glucagon effectively. So when the autoimmune attack takes out the beta cells that secrete insulin, it disrupts the alpha cells' ability to release glucagon. They still make glucagon. They just don't release it in any coordinated and useful way anymore. So they really have a dual hormone insufficiency, and that should never be ignored. Yeah. And so that's one of the things we do at Beta Bionics is not ignore that, right? We build an entire technology platform that will look just like this one, right? It won't be any bigger. It'll have, we built a second chamber here to take a glucagon chamber. And this is actually the exact same platform that we'll be testing in the pivotal trial with the 2-hormone system.
When is that going to happen?
So our goal is to have that start by the end of the year.
2023.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we want to have that trial start by the end of the year. Now that trial is huge. So as I mentioned, the single hormone study, the bihormonal pivotal trial, the Bionic Pancreas pivotal trial with a single hormone device was the largest automated insulin delivery randomized control trial ever done, right? By a long shot. The bihormonal pivotal trial will be way larger. In fact, 8 times larger in terms of the number of patient years of exposure. So it won't be a 3-month trial. It'll be a 12-month trial. It won't involve 440 people. It'll involve over 700 people.
Wow.
And we're going to have phases. So if we start by the end of this year, the first phase will be a small cohort of 70 or so people, and they'll engage in a crossover trial with the final bihormonal device and the single hormone device that you see here. And people will use both in a crossover design. So they'll spend like 4 to 6 weeks in the single hormone Islet and 4 to 6 weeks in the bihormonal crossover in random order. Once that study's done, that'll take about 6 months or so. We read out the data. And if everything looks good and we like the way the system is performing, we lock in and we start the big 1-year randomized trial. And a 1-year trial doesn't take 1 year to do. Because when you have 700 people and 30 clinical sites, we had 16 sites in the other trial, 30 sites or so, it takes a half a year just to load everybody into the trial, all 700 people, and then a year for the last person in to finish. That's an 18-month commitment. So it's a long road, right? It's going to be a couple of years, 2.5 years, just to get to the last participant, last visit of the bihormonal trial. Yeah. And then you have to build the FDA package, submit that, and they have to review not just the bihormonal Islet, but here's the big, sort of the long pole in the tent. They also have to review the glucagon. Glucagon's never been used chronically. It's only used as a rescue. And so Zealand Pharma will have to put in their own application for dasiglucagon, as they call it, their analog of human glucagon, which is typically a 12-month review process with the FDA that'll go in parallel with our bihormonal Islet review.
Did they have to wait for this first Islet to be approved to do that?
No,
it's just time.
No, it's just that we were just, we couldn't do too many things at once.
Is there anything about any patents you hold that would stop an insulin pump company from going to a dual hormone or?
We have intellectual property portfolio that I think is pretty robust, not just in terms of the bihormonal, but also the single hormone algorithms. So I think that on our algorithm side, we have some IP out there on bihormonal that's pretty robust. But ultimately, we're not engaging in an exclusive relationship with Zealand Pharma. So if somebody wanted to build a dual chamber system, they'd have to sort of work around our IP and build their own algorithms, and they'd have to work with Zealand Pharma to figure out how they're going to use their drug. But it is true that if we do the pivotal trial with the Zealand Pharma 4 mg per ml concentration drug, that particular very specific formulation, and get FDA approval of that, any other pump company that builds a dual chamber system would not have to do as long a study with the Zealand Pharma 4 mg per ml formulation, because it's been proven out to work in chronic use this way.
So is this going to be 2 different infusion sets?
Well, in the trial, it will be, but ultimately that's not our intent for the commercial product. So we can start the trial and do the pivotal trial with 2 separate sets. And all of our pre-pivotal studies use 2 separate sets. And they're both uniomedical infusion sets. One was an insulin and one was a glucagon. And we put them right next to each other. They're about a centimeter apart. What we'll ultimately want to do is build a single set that has, a couple of cannula in it. You'd insert that in one go every like 3 days or so. Yeah. But you will have 2 separate tubes that you could sort of tie together like speaker wire here, like at the head jack wire. And the reason it's important that you have the 2 separate tubes is because the insulin cartridge might last 3 days on average, in the average adult, say, and the glucagon cartridge might last a week. They're not going to be changed on the same frequency. There's no reason to change them both out if one still has a few days left in the cartridge.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah. I was just trying to I always have, people always ask, for years, when is they always say when are they going to put them all in one device? And I'm like, I don't know what you're thinking about. Like, you want like a CGM and a pump in the same like structure, which I'm like, that can't happen. Like, forget business. No. Like functionally, it can't happen. Right.
Well, the thing about it is that with transcutaneous CGM sensors, right, they typically are lasting 10 to 14 days, right? And we now have infusion sets out there that are FDA approved to be used for up to 7 days. But they don't, on average, last 7 days. That's what they can be used up to.
Right.
But on average, they last shorter than that. Well, why is that? Well, mainly what fails with infusion sets very often is the adhesive. Yeah. It fails. And when you are infusing liquid, insulin under the skin, the adhesive, you have a tube that's connected to it. As you move around, that tube is putting a little bit of stress on the infusion set all day long, every time you twist and turn, and it's tugging on that set. And so the adhesive ultimately is overwhelmed. And after 3-4 days, some people can run it out longer, but other people can't. And it depends on how the adhesive works with your skin and so forth. But generally, someone who uses an infusion set for 4 or 5 days will start to see, if they go well beyond its intended use, we'll start to see the set fail. And what happens is the insulin starts flowing up around the cannula and wets the skin and doesn't go into the body.
Yeah.
But if you look at a sensor, you put a sensor in and there's not nearly as much stress in pulling on it. There's nothing connected to it, right? Your shirt touches it, but you're not pulling on it with a tube every now and again. And that adhesive can really last longer. And it's more forgiving, the sensor under the skin, if it moves a little bit around relative to the tissue versus a cannula where insulin can then leak out.
Yeah.
So they have very inherently different lifetime, or characteristic times when they can stay under the skin.
I wish people could have seen you, because I enjoyed watching the engineer and you go, no, like the face you made. And because I always think that I always think like simple things, like, first of all, what do you like? You're going to build an Omnipod that has a Dexcom in it, like that. How's that going to happen? And what happens if your sensor goes bad in 3 days, but your pump's work, or 2 days, but your pump's working fine? Like, you want to rip the whole thing off? Like, I understand the desire, but I always feel like that question's asked by somebody who's never built anything before in their whole life. And
they're just inherently different, lifelines, or whatever you would say, the lifetime expectancy of those two systems are so inherently different. And you don't want them to be coupled, because as you just said, you don't want to have to change all three because only one failed.
Right. Now, okay. All right. So, Ed, I've had you for a long time, longer than I promised. I have one question, and then I'm going to ask you if there's anything we haven't talked about. A number of people ask me, Islet, how, 40 carbs of, I don't know, a soft pretzel and 40 carbs of cotton candy, 40 and 40, but significantly different impacts. It doesn't matter to the Islet?
No, it really doesn't, because as I mentioned before, it's because the corrections algorithm is always running in the background. So suppose you have, what you're really getting at, I think, is a food that's got a very high glycemic index versus one that's got a very low glycemic index and takes longer to raise your blood sugar. Or it's just more muted, right? You just don't go up as much. It's just extended out to over a longer period of time. So the Islet is watching every 5 minutes, and it has, unlike most hybrid closed-loop systems, it has the occasion or the opportunity to dose every 5 minutes if it needs to. So it's always on top of it. So if you do the meal announcement for that 40 grams of cotton candy, you're going to see a very fast rise, and the meal announcement is going to kick in. And it's going to keep track. The Islet keeps track of the insulin in that meal announcement dose that it just gave. And it watches the glucose rise. And it says, okay, you've got all this insulin pending. I'm keeping track of its rise and its clearance. And I'm watching your glucose rise. Now, if you rise very quickly, it might just stay in the background for a while. There'll come a point where it'll say, I'm going to need to add a little bit more correction insulin now, because the correction algorithm has been quiet. But now I think that you've risen high enough that the meal announcement insulin, even the insulin that's pending from that meal announcement, isn't enough. So I'm going to add a little bit more. And then it's going to watch. It's going to keep watching, and it's very patient because it's keeping track of the insulin it just added in addition to the meal announcement insulin. And then it'll see it crest. If it's a very high glycemic index food, it's just going to rise quickly and then stop and then start coming down. And it'll see it come down. It'll just back off. Your blood sugar could be 250, 220. If it sees it slow down, it's going to back off. It doesn't care that you're a little hyperglycemic. It knows that insulin's coming. It's going to say, be patient. And now, what if instead you didn't rise nearly as much because it's a low glycemic index food? Now you went up to 190 or 220 instead of 250 or 260. And it sees that meal announcement's enough. It's really enough. I'm going to stay back and I'm going to stay quiet. And now an hour's gone by and you're sort of sit there and now you're coming down to 170 and it's an hour and a half after the meal announcement, but you're still a little bit stubborn. And then it's going to say, well, that meal announcement's getting old now. And I'm the correction algorithm checking in every 5 minutes. I've decided at this step, finally, that meal announcement's not enough given that you're 170. I'm going to start adding a little correction insulin now. Mm-hmm. And so it's very patient in looking at the meal announcement doses and how much your glycemic excursion has risen and how much it's responding to that before it weighs in on adding more. But it's always there to add it if it needs to. And it's using very precise mathematics to make that very objective decision. It's not irrational and it doesn't rage bolus.
Right.
But it does ask that you, the user, be patient. And what that usually means is don't keep looking at the Islet and expect magical results and say, oh my God, I'm still 170. Just let it do its thing. And that is ultimately the message that we want to convey to people who use the Islet is let it work. Don't fuss over it too much. Just make sure you maintain the care and feeding of it.
Right.
But let it do its thing and don't try and meddle with it too much. Because it won't help. It doesn't get better glucose control just because you're watching it, and it doesn't get worse glucose control if you don't watch it. That's another thing we learned from the pivotal trial. You don't have to look at it all the time to get the same equally good control. And with other diabetes therapies, right? We know that the more you interact with a finger stick meter, the more you interact with your CGM or an insulin pen, or a pump or a hybrid closed-loop system, the better your glucose control typically is. If you look at a group of people who interact frequently with their, diabetes therapy or diagnostic, or another group of people who interact infrequently with it, those who interact frequently tend to do better statistically. We don't see that with the Islet. We see that it's pretty agnostic to how much you engage with the device, as long as you're taking care of it. And that's a really important point to remember.
No, it's a bonus for sure.
And the other thing I'd like to just sort of have you. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was please. You're fine. I'm trying to wrap you up. If you want to keep talking, I'm happy for you to keep talking. I'm just trying to help you out of this.
Oh yeah, very good. I do have a call coming up in a few minutes, but I would say this, that what is unique here there's a number of things about the Islet I think that are unique, right? It's unique in several ways, but importantly, it determines 100% of every therapeutic dose of insulin. And it's not a system where you can go and override the dose. You can't add a correction insulin bolus. You can't add a meal dose. You can't say, I didn't give myself enough insulin, so I'm going to add 20 grams of carbs, and it's going to then figure out what to dose, which is what a lot of people do in some of these systems. It determines 100% of every therapeutic dose, and you don't override that, and your physician doesn't override that.
Yeah.
So that is not a hybrid system. A hybrid system inherently means that you are playing a role in insulin dosing decision, you and your physician, as well as some automation. That is not what's going on here. And as a result of that, you have to really get comfortable with this new world of fully automated insulin dosing decision making that's being handed to a device.
I have to say, I'm actually impressed, and I think it's smart that you're talking about it so directly. You're not doing any marketing, talking around. You're like, look, this is what it does. If that's good for you, then great. And if not, it was nice talking to you. I think that's terrific. I don't see enough of that. I've been very impressed with that the entire time you've been going over this. So I really do appreciate it. Do you think there's anything we didn't talk about that we should have?
Not really. I mean, I guess it's more reemphasizing this idea that the reason I think we can talk so frankly about is, first of all, we want to build technology that's in the best interest of people with type 1, and we've always been committed to that. And that means that, the Islet, I think, is that device that is very complementary to some of the high tech out there that does serve the interests or the needs of those people who are already in good control, or who have the access to the best resources, the best healthcare. And, and so we're trying to address that other segment, which I think so happens to be the majority of people with type 1 who don't have all the resources and all the access to the best healthcare. You realize that, 75% of U.S. counties do not have a single endocrinologist in their borders, right? This is something that the Ozers published a few years ago. And whereas 95% of counties in the U.S., so 75% of counties don't even have one endo. 95% of counties have at least one primary care physician. Primary care physicians can't use that high tech. It's anathema to them. I mean, they don't have They don't have the resources. They don't have the staff. They don't have the training.
Yeah.
They can't use that tech. But we think the iLet is a device, a very high-tech device that is really the first device that plays very well in primary care because it is for that large 80% of people who aren't meeting goal. And I do think for those who are meeting goal, many of them will still prefer the iLet because they're going to be unburdened of a lot of the cognitive effort and that burden that goes along with constantly being all over your diabetes management all the time.
Right.
And there'll be others in that same group who just, are just too anxious to give that control up. So it's really all about finding those people that are going to benefit from it and who will be able to do that comfortably. And I think it's a lot of people out there that we're trying to serve.
Will you be adding salespeople? I mean, it's because it feels like you're going to have to go to non-traditional doctors to talk about insulin pumps,
Yeah, we have. So we have a very small group at start. And so we've got about 16 people on the sales team right now who are focused in those 8 territories I was telling you about. And what we've been doing these past couple of months, Stephen Russell and I have been going to all those territories with each of the the two commercial people in each of those regions and meeting with the clinical sites that we've targeted in those regions to launch the product and spending a few hours with each of those clinical teams and with our commercial team with us at each of those sites so that they get introduced to these folks who we've been working with for years, frankly, or many of them. And so that's how we're doing it at first, is we're sort of introducing the commercial team to the people we've worked with over the years in the clinical setting, in the clinical research setting, and ourselves being introduced to the clinical people who aren't doing clinical research, but who work with our clinical research scientist collaborators. So that introduction is happening, and that's where we're focusing the launch. And then as we get experience in those 8 territories in the fall, then we expand to more territories. So we've been doing a lot of traveling, getting on the road and seeing a lot of these sites. And we've been back and forth across the country, 17 sites in the past 9 weeks.
Wow. That's amazing. No,
it's been a busy pace.
I mean, because you're going to go to the trouble of, listen to this story, how long it took to make this thing. And now it's the last piece, right? Like, how do you set it in someone's hand? And it's not apples to apples, but I'm a person who's trying to deliver something to people too. And you would never know it if I wouldn't say it out loud, but that's the hardest part of this job. It's making the thing is great. And then giving it to somebody it's the hard part, So.
Yeah. And it's all about scalability. So I'll leave you with this notion. If you think about what the diabetes control and complications trial did between 1983 and 1993 was to test the hypothesis, right? This was a landmark study. Many clinical sites across the country took 1,500 people and randomized about half of them into conventional therapy, they called it, which was, not multiple shots a day or insulin pump therapy. It was just 1 or 2 shots a day. Or intensive therapy, where they were checking their blood sugar 7 times a day, but importantly, they were giving multiple shots many times a day or using a pump. Mm-hmm. And what they found was they could dramatically reduce mean glucose and HbA1c in the intensive therapy group and sustain that for a period of 6.5 years on average for each person, at huge effort on the part of the patients who randomized to intensive therapy and the physicians that supported them, the clinicians that supported them. And they were testing the hypothesis back then. It wasn't known that good glycemic control was necessary to stave off long-term complications of diabetes. That was a contested point back in the early 80s. Mm. And until we had the HbA1c test and insulin pump therapy and finger stick meters, we couldn't really test the hypothesis. If you take a bunch of people and control their glucose well, do they have fewer long-term complications than those who you don't? And resoundingly, the DCCT, the Diabetes Control and Complications Trial, showed us that by 1993 that you markedly reduce long-term complications. And that study took about 10 years to do. Yep. And 30 years ago this month, it was read out to the diabetes community that you got to do this. Well, 10 years after that study, we started building the Bionic Pancreas. And in that 10-year period, and we've been doing it for 20 years, but in this period after the DCCT, what we also found is it's not scalable. You can't do what the DCCT did in a large scale. Everybody's A1C is more like in the 8s, low 8s, not 7, which is what they were able to do with the DCCT. So it wasn't for 30 years after the DCCT that there's a device now that we think can reach broadly a much larger audience than most diabetes tech. People with type 1, that is something you can put in your pocket and you type in your body weight and do these few meal announcements a day and keep it going and get glucose control that's comparable to what the DCCT achieved in the intensive group. And so we sort of answered the question, is there a scalable solution here? Yeah. And I think the iLet is that device.
No, it sounds like it. I mean, I've really appreciated you telling me so much about it, but I'm excited for you to to get it going and get it out there. How long do you think it'll be? It's June till I see somebody online going, I use an Islet.
Online?
Yeah, like somebody takes a picture on their Instagram. Like, when am I going to see that? Like
in a month.
Really?
In less than I think in a month.
Okay.
I think we'll have one or two people at the ADA conference next week on the Islet.
Okay. Oh, wow.
But on Instagram, I think on social media, I think you'll see something come up within the next month.
Pretty amazing. Okay, Ed, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Of course, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Hey, huge thanks to Ed for coming on the show today and telling us all about iLet. I also want to thank US Med for sponsoring this episode of the Juicebox Podcast. I'll remind you to go to usmed.com/juicebox or call 888-721-1514 to get your free benefits check so you can get started with US Med. Check out that private Facebook group, Juicebox Podcast, Type 1 Diabetes on Facebook. It's absolutely free. It's for everybody. I don't care what kind of diabetes you have. I don't care how you eat. There's a beautiful community there with over 40,000 people in it waiting for you. This podcast is sponsored every week by great companies. I'll list them in a moment, but if you have the need or the interest, please use my links when you're finding out more. It really does help to support the podcast. If you want to check out the Omnipod, Dexcom, US Med, the Contour Next Gen Blood Glucose Meter, Gvoke HypoPen, Athletic Greens, Cozy Earth, BetterHelp, Touched by Type 1, they're all there. Just look in the show notes of the audio app you're listening in now, or go to juiceboxpodcast.com. When you click on those links, you're supporting the production of this podcast and keeping it free. The podcast is sponsored today by BetterHelp. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service and is 100% online. With BetterHelp, you can tap into a network of over 25,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with a wide range of issues. BetterHelp.com/juicebox. To get started, you just answer a few questions about your needs and preferences in therapy. That way, BetterHelp can match you with the right therapist from their network. And when you use my link, you'll save 10% on your first month of therapy. You can message your therapist at any time and schedule live sessions when it's convenient for you. Talk to them however you feel comfortable. Text, chat, phone, or video call. If your therapist isn't the right fit, for any reason at all, you can switch to a new therapist at no additional charge. And the best part for me is that with BetterHelp, you get the same professionalism and quality you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom picked for you. And you're going to get more scheduling flexibility and a more affordable price. I myself have just begun using BetterHelp. BetterHelp.com/juicebox. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/juicebox. Save 10% on your first month of therapy. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Juicebox Podcast.